An American soldier stands between a German woman and a rifle barrel. May 1945. Occupied Germany. A sergeant risks his life for an enemy civilian. This is the story of how hunger, compassion, and a marriage certificate transformed two enemies into a family that would span an ocean. May 7th, 1945. The bakery wall stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. Margaret Hoffman knelt in the rubble where her family's business had been, her fingers bleeding as she scraped through ash and brick dust. 23 years old, alone. Her stomach had stopped growling 3 days ago. A bad sign. The smell hit her first. Smoke. Different from the acrid burning that had filled the air for months. This smoke carried something else. Food. Real food. Her hands stopped moving. Her breath caught. She looked up. 50 yards away, American soldiers clustered around field kitchens. Steam rose from metal containers. The wind shifted. Bacon, coffee, bread. Margaret's vision blurred. She had not seen bread in 7 weeks. Her father had baked bread every morning for 32 years. The ovens had been cold since March. Her mother had died in the cellar during the bombing. Her brother somewhere on the Eastern Front. No word in 11 months. Her father 3 weeks ago, pneumonia and starvation working together. She was rummaging through ruins for grain that was not there. A shadow fell across the broken bricks. Margaret looked up. An American sergeant stood 6 feet away, his uniform clean, his face uncertain. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sandy hair and blue eyes that looked too kind for a soldier. He held a tin plate in his hands. "Ma'am," he said. She did not speak English well. She understood the tone. He extended the plate toward her. Scrambled eggs, toast, 2 strips of bacon, a small pile of beans. Margaret stared at the food. Her hands trembled. This was the enemy. This was the nation that had bombed her city, killed thousands, destroyed everything. This man wore the uniform of occupation. The plate came closer. His eyes met hers. No pity, no triumph. Just something else. Recognition, maybe. Human to human. She took the plate. Her fingers touched warm ceramic. The first bite of eggs made her throat close. Too rich, too sudden. Her body had forgotten abundance. She ate slowly, forcing herself to chew, to breathe, to not weep. The sergeant watched for a moment, then walked back to his unit. She did not know his name. She did not know he would return the next day. She did not know that this moment, this simple transfer of a tin plate, would alter the geography of her entire life. William Barker had been in Europe for 14 months. He had seen combat in France, had crossed the Rhine, had witnessed things he would never discuss with his family back in Oklahoma. He was a practical man, a farmer's son, trained in radio communications but assigned to supply management in the final weeks of the war. He had been taught that Germans were the enemy, fanatics, dangerous, to be defeated and controlled. The woman in the ruins did not match that training. He returned the next morning. She was there again, digging through the same pile of rubble. Her hands were wrapped in torn cloth now, makeshift bandages. She looked up when she heard his boots on broken concrete. "Ma'am," he said again, another plate. Oatmeal this time, a slice of bread with butter, an apple. She took it without speaking. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, the color of the sky before snow. This became their routine. Every morning for 6 days, he brought food. She ate. They did not speak beyond basic greetings. His English, her limited vocabulary, the gulf between occupier and occupied. On the 7th day, he brought an interpreter. Private Morrison, a German-American from Pennsylvania who spoke both languages fluently. "Ask her name," William said. Morrison spoke in rapid German. The woman looked between them, then answered quietly. "Margaret Hoffman," Morrison translated. She was a teacher, primary school, before the war. "Ask her about her family." The conversation took 20 minutes. William stood quietly, watching Margaret's face as she spoke, seeing the way her shoulders tensed when she mentioned her brother, the way her voice dropped when she described her father's death. Morrison turned back to William. "She's alone. Parents dead, brother missing, probably dead. No other relatives. She's been living in the basement of a partially collapsed building 4 blocks from here. No food except what she can scavenge. No work. The schools are destroyed." William nodded slowly. Around them, the occupation continued. Soldiers sorted supplies. Officers shouted orders. Civilians moved through checkpoints. The machinery of control and rebuilding. "Tell her I'll bring food every day," William said. Tell her. Tell her she doesn't have to dig through ruins anymore," Morrison translated. Margaret looked at William for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "If you're moved by this act of humanity across enemy lines, a like helps share stories like these with others who need to hear them." Now the daily meetings became conversations. Through Morrison's translation, William learned about Margaret's life before the war. She had taught children ages 6 through 10, reading, arithmetic, basic science. She had loved the work, had believed education could build a better Germany. Then the requirements changed. Political education, mandatory youth programs, teachers who questioned were removed. Margaret had kept her head down, taught reading and numbers, avoided the new curricula when she could. "Many of us knew," she told him through Morrison, her voice flat. "We knew things were wrong, but what could we do? Speak out? Disappear? Protect our families? Watch the country descend? There was no good choice." William listened. He had been raised to see the world in clear categories: right and wrong, ally and enemy, good and evil. The woman sitting across from him in the ruins complicated all of that. She asked him questions too, about America, about Oklahoma, about farms and open spaces, and a country that had not been bombed. "Wheat fields," he told her, his hands gesturing to show the scope. "Thousands of acres, sky so big it hurts to look at. Harvest time, the grain turns gold all the way to the horizon," Morrison translated. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "I cannot imagine," she said in halting English, then switched back to German. "Space, room, air without smoke." The food continued. William brought more than military rations now. He traded cigarettes and chocolate with local farmers for fresh eggs, vegetables, milk. Margaret's face filled out slowly. Color returned to her cheeks. Her hands healed. One morning she was not in the ruins. William felt his chest tighten, an unexpected fear. Had something happened? Had she been relocated? Arrested? He found her 2 blocks away, sweeping the steps of a partially intact church. An elderly priest stood in the doorway, watching her work. "She comes every day now," Morrison translated the priest's German. "Helps clean, helps organize the food distribution we're trying to establish. She's a good woman, lost everything, but still helps others." William watched her sweep. Efficient movements. Purpose. Not just surviving anymore. Rebuilding. That night, lying in his tent, he realized something had shifted. He was not thinking about her as a duty, not as an act of charity. He was thinking about her, Margaret, the way she tilted her head when she tried to understand English, the way she smiled, rare but genuine, when he brought something unexpected, like the oranges he had scrounged last week. This was dangerous territory. July 19th, 1945. The word came down through channels. William's unit was being redeployed. East toward Austria and Czechoslovakia. Departure in 10 days. He stood in the command tent, the orders in his hand, feeling something hollow open in his chest. 10 days. He found Margaret at the church, helping sort donated clothing. When she saw his face, she stopped working. "What's wrong?" she asked in English. He told her, watched understanding dawn in her eyes, watched her hands go still on the cotton dress she had been folding. "I see," she said quietly. Then switching to German, spoke quickly to Morrison. "I understand. You have your orders. I'm grateful for everything you've done. I won't forget." That night, William could not sleep. Around him, other soldiers snored, talked quietly, played cards. He stared at the canvas ceiling and did arithmetic he did not want to do. Margaret returning to full starvation. Weeks, maybe a month. Margaret without protection in occupied territory, vulnerable to everything. Margaret staying in Germany, a future of rubble and reconstruction that would take decades. By morning, he had made a decision that felt both insane and inevitable. He found her before breakfast. Morrison was still asleep, so William stood there with his limited German and her limited English, and somehow made himself understood. "Come with me," he said, "to America." As my wife. Margaret stared at him. For 10 seconds, she said nothing. Then she spoke in careful English. You do not know me. Not really. We have spoken, yes, for weeks. But marriage, this is... She searched for words, then switched to German, speaking rapidly. William caught enough to understand. She was listing obstacles, regulations, immigration law, the impossibility of it, the scandal of marrying an enemy national, the practical problems of a hasty marriage. He waited for her to finish. Then he pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. He sketched quickly a basic diagram. The United States, Oklahoma, a house, fields, space. No bomb, he said. No hunger, no ruins. Work, future, life. Margaret looked at the crude drawing. Her hands trembled slightly. Why? She asked. Simple question, enormous weight. William met her eyes. He had been trained in radio codes, supply logistics, military procedure. He had not been trained for this. Because leaving you here is wrong, he said slowly. Because you deserve more than survival. Because... He paused, then said the rest in English, hoping she would understand the tone, if not every word. Because I think about you every damn day, and I can't imagine going back to Oklahoma knowing you're here alone. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. This is crazy, she said in English. Yes, he agreed. We barely know each other. Yes. It might not work. Might not. She looked at the drawing again. The simple house, the wheat fields, the space. When? She asked. The military chaplain was skeptical. Captain Henderson was openly opposed. The paperwork was a nightmare. German civilian marriages to American military personnel were technically permitted but heavily discouraged. There were forms, investigations, background checks, interviews. William filled out every form, answered every question, sat through a 45-minute lecture from Captain Henderson about fraternization, about enemy nationals, about making emotional decisions in the aftermath of war. This woman could be anyone, Sergeant, Henderson said. Could have been a party member. Could be using you to get to America. Could be... She's a teacher who lost her family and nearly starved to death, William interrupted. Sir, he added belatedly. Henderson stared at him. You're willing to risk your career, your reputation, your family's reaction? Yes, sir. The investigation took 3 weeks. William's unit had already deployed. He had been temporarily reassigned to administrative duties to complete the marriage process. Every day felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if someone would push him off. Margaret was interviewed 6 times, her background checked, her teaching records examined, her political affiliations investigated, the destroyed school where she had worked, the church where she now volunteered, the priest who vouched for her character. Finally, on August 23, 1945, the permission came through. The ceremony took place in the same church where Margaret swept stairs. The priest officiated, speaking in German and English. Morrison served as translator and witness. 2 other soldiers from William's original unit stood as additional witnesses. Margaret wore a dress donated by the church. Simple cotton, pale blue, carefully mended. William wore his dress uniform. Neither of them had rings. The vows were standard, brief, legal. When William said, I do, his voice was steady. When Margaret said, Ja, ich will, hers was too. They kissed, a short, chaste kiss. Husband and wife. Outside the church, reality waited. William had orders to report to his new deployment in 2 days. Margaret had immigration paperwork that would take months to process. The visa application, the medical examination, the transportation arrangements. How long? Margaret asked that night. They were in the small room she had been living in, the basement of a partially collapsed building, now slightly more furnished with items William had scrounged. 6 months, maybe, William said. Could be 8. Could be a year. The immigration system is backed up. Thousands of applications. Margaret nodded. She had expected this. But knowing and accepting were different things. I'll wait, she said simply. William took her hand. I'll write every week. I'll send money. I'll make sure you have food and safety. I promise. She squeezed his fingers. I believe you. 2 days later, William Barker left Germany. His wife of 48 hours stood at a checkpoint, watching his truck disappear into the distance. She did not cry until he was completely out of sight. Then she returned to the church and asked the priest if she could help organize the new food distribution program they were starting. Waiting was easier with purpose. September 1945. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after William left. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Dear Margaret, made it to Austria. Can't tell you much about the work. Military censorship. But I'm safe. Thinking about you every day. How are you? Is the food supply holding? Is the church still giving you work? Oklahoma in autumn is beautiful. The leaves turn gold and red. The air gets crisp. You'll see it next year. Hold on to that. Yours when I'm... William. Margaret read it 5 times. Then she borrowed paper from the priest and wrote back. Her English was improving. The priest had found her an old grammar textbook, and she studied every night by candlelight. Dear William, your letter came. I am well. The church work continues. Father Klaus has me teaching basic reading to children who lost schooling in the war. It helps. Staying busy helps. I think about Oklahoma, about space and wheat fields. It seems like a dream, a good dream. I will wait, however long it takes. Margaret. The letters became their marriage. William wrote about his days, the boring parts he was allowed to mention, the small frustrations, the moments when he missed home. Margaret wrote about reconstruction, about the slow return of normal life, about the children she taught. In November, William sent money, $50, a fortune in occupied Germany. Use this for whatever you need, he wrote. Better clothes, food, savings. I'm sending more next month. You're my wife. Let me take care of you. Margaret cried over that letter. She used half the money for winter clothes. The other half she gave to the church food program. December brought snow and a marriage certificate in the mail, the official copy stamped and sealed. Margaret tucked it into her small suitcase, next to the few photographs she had saved from the ruins. Evidence. Proof. A future. January 1946. The visa application was processed. Margaret received a letter instructing her to report for a medical examination in Frankfurt. She borrowed money from Father Klaus for the train ticket. The examination took 4 hours. Chest x-ray, blood tests, physical measurements, questions about her health history. The American immigration officer was brusque, efficient, uninterested in her story. You're married to Sergeant William Barker, currently deployed in Austria? Yes. When was the marriage? August 23rd, 1945. Purpose of immigration? To join my husband. Stamps, signatures, more waiting. Subscribe to hear the rest of Margaret's incredible journey, how she crossed an ocean alone and built a family in a foreign land. March 12, 1946, 7 months after the wedding. Margaret stood on the dock in Bremen, holding a single suitcase and a folder of documents. Around her, dozens of other women waited. War brides, displaced persons, refugees seeking new lives. The ship was called the Marine Falcon, a converted troop transport now carrying civilians westward. Margaret's ticket was in the name Margaret Barker, her first time seeing her married name in print. The crossing took 11 days. Margaret shared a cabin with 3 other German women married to American soldiers. They were all terrified, all hopeful, all leaving behind everything they had ever known. The Atlantic in March was rough. Margaret was sick for the first 3 days, her stomach heaving with the waves. On the 4th day, she managed to stay on deck, breathing salt air, watching gray water extend to the horizon. One of her cabin mates, a woman named Else, stood beside her. Nervous? Else asked in German. Terrified, Margaret admitted. Me too. My husband's family sent a letter. They're not happy about the marriage. They think I'm a Nazi trying to infiltrate their farm. Else laughed bitterly. My father was arrested by the Gestapo in 1940. But they don't know that. They just know I'm German. Margaret had received one letter from William's family. His mother. Brief, formal, correct. William has informed us of your marriage. We look forward to meeting you. Please know that our home is now your home." The words were right. The tone was uncertain. "We'll make it work," Margaret said, to Elsa, to herself, to the ocean. On March 23, 1946, the Marine Falcon docked in New York Harbor. Margaret stood on deck with hundreds of others, staring at the Manhattan skyline. Tall buildings, so many lights, noise and movement, an overwhelming scale. She cleared immigration in 4 hours. The officer checked her documents, stamped her passport, asked basic questions. She was now a permanent resident of the United States, pending final naturalization. The train to Oklahoma took 3 days. Margaret sat by the window, watching America scroll past. The size of it, the space, fields that went on forever, towns that had not been bombed, people who looked well-fed and moved without fear. March 26th, Tulsa Station, late afternoon. Margaret stepped off the train carrying her suitcase, wearing her best dress, the same blue one from the wedding, carefully preserved, and looked for William in the crowd. She saw him before he saw her, taller than she remembered, thinner, still in uniform. He had not been discharged yet. He was scanning the crowd, his face tense. Their eyes met, his face transformed. Relief, joy, disbelief. He moved toward her through the crowd. She set down her suitcase. They stood 2 feet apart for a moment, strangers who were married, separated by an ocean, and 8 months and everything that had happened. Then William pulled her into his arms. "You're here," he said into her hair. "You're actually here." Margaret held on to him. He smelled like soap and cigarette smoke, and something else, something that would become familiar as home. "I'm here," she said in English. Then in German, "Ich bin here." Behind William, 3 people stood watching. An older couple and a young man, his family, his parents and younger brother. Margaret straightened, smoothed her dress, prepared herself. William's mother was named Dorothy, 52 years old, gray hair pulled back, wearing a simple house dress and pearls. Her face was carefully neutral. William's father was Frank, 56, weathered face, farmer's hands, eyes that assessed everything. He stood like a man who had built everything he owned and trusted nothing he had not tested. William's brother was James, called Jimmy. 19, too young for the war, curious and uncomfortable in equal measure. "Mom, Dad, Jimmy, this is Margaret, my wife." William's hand rested on Margaret's back. Dorothy stepped forward first, extended her hand. Margaret shook it. "Welcome to America, dear," Dorothy said. Her voice was pleasant, empty of emotion. Frank nodded once. "Ma'am." Jimmy stared, then looked away. The drive to the farm was 40 minutes. Margaret sat in the back of the truck between William and Jimmy. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick as smoke. The Barker farm was 200 acres of wheat and grazing land. The house was white clapboard, 2 stories, with a wide porch and a barn out back. Chickens pecked in the yard. A dog barked from somewhere. Dorothy showed Margaret to the second-floor bedroom. "This is where you and William will stay. There's a bathroom down the hall. Dinner is at 6. We keep regular hours." "Thank you," Margaret said carefully. Dorothy paused at the door. "William is a good man. I raised him to be honest and hard-working. I hope—" She stopped. "I hope you'll be good to him." The unspoken words hung in the air. "Even though you're German, even though we don't know you, even though this all seems hasty and strange." "I will," Margaret said. "I promise." Dorothy nodded and left. Margaret sat on the bed. It was the softest mattress she had felt in years. The room was clean and neat and completely foreign. She could hear voices downstairs. William's voice, then his father's, then silence. She unpacked her suitcase. 3 dresses, undergarments, her teaching certificate from Germany, useless here. The wedding photograph someone had taken at the church. The letters from William, tied with string. This was her home now. She had to make it work. The first week was performed. Margaret learned the house routines. Breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Dorothy ran the kitchen with military precision. Margaret offered to help and was given tasks: peeling vegetables, washing dishes, setting the table. Conversation was minimal. Dorothy asked basic questions. Where in Germany? What did her father do? Did she have siblings? Margaret answered carefully, leaving out the bombing, the starvation, the ruins. These people did not want to hear about German suffering. Frank spoke to her twice the first week, once to ask if she knew anything about farming. No, sir, she said, once to tell her the bathroom schedule. We can serve hot water. Baths are Tuesdays and Fridays. Jimmy avoided her entirely. William tried to bridge the gap. At dinner, he told stories about the farm, about his childhood, about Oklahoma. He included Margaret in the conversation, asked her opinions, translated when she struggled with English words. But at night, when they were alone in their room, he was tired. Give them time, he said. They'll come around. It's a lot for them, me coming home married to a German woman. They never expected this. I understand, Margaret said. She did understand, but understanding did not make it easier. The second week, Dorothy found Margaret standing in the kitchen, staring at the cookbook open on the counter. Margaret was crying silently, tears running down her face. What's wrong? Dorothy asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Margaret gestured helplessly at the cookbook. I do not know how to make American food. I do not know your measurements. I do not know your ingredients. I try to help, but I am useless here. Dorothy stood very still. Then she pulled out a chair. Sit down. Margaret sat. Dorothy poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Margaret, sat across from her. You're not useless, Dorothy said quietly. You're in a new country with new food and new customs and new everything. That's not useless. That's overwhelmed. Margaret wiped her eyes. I want to be good wife. I want to be help. She struggled for words. I want to belong. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. The careful neutrality cracked slightly. Tomorrow morning, Dorothy said, you and I are going to make biscuits. I'll show you American measurements, American techniques, American food, one thing at a time, and you're going to teach me some German recipes because William loves you and you love him, and that means we're family now, whether we expected it or not. Margaret stared at her. You mean this? I always mean what I say. Dorothy stood up. 6 o'clock tomorrow. Wear an apron. Spring turned to summer. Margaret learned to make biscuits, cornbread, fried chicken, green bean casserole. Dorothy learned to make Kartoffelsalat, schnitzel, and a simplified version of Black Forest cake. The kitchen became their territory, their neutral ground. They talked while cooking, carefully at first, then more openly. Dorothy asked real questions. What was it like during the war? How did Margaret survive? What did she miss most about Germany? Margaret answered honestly, told about the fear, the hunger, the rubble. Told about teaching children who had seen too much. Told about William appearing with a plate of food like an angel in a nightmare. He saved my life, Margaret said simply. Not just the food, the hope. He gave me hope when I had none left. Dorothy's hands paused over the pie dough she was rolling. William always was too kind for his own good, even as a boy. Brought home injured birds, stray dogs, lost children, drove his father crazy. It is not weakness, Margaret said. No, Dorothy agreed. It's not. Frank was harder to reach. He rarely spoke to Margaret directly, but she noticed things. The way he left the newspaper on the kitchen table, folded to articles about reconstruction in Europe. The way he nodded when she worked in the vegetable garden. The way he did not object when William and Margaret took drives into town together. Jimmy thawed last. He was 19 and awkward and uncertain how to talk to a foreign woman who was technically his sister-in-law, but he loved music. Margaret heard him playing piano one evening, self-taught, clumsy but enthusiastic. She stood in the doorway, listening. When he finished, she said, You play well. Jimmy jumped. Oh, I'm not very good. I played piano too, before the war. Not much, but some. She gestured to the bench. May I? Jimmy moved over. Margaret sat down, put her hands on the keys, played a simple German folk song her mother had taught her. Her fingers were rusty, the notes uncertain, but the melody was clear. When she finished, Jimmy was staring at her. That was really pretty, he said. What was it? German lullaby. My mother sang it to me when I was a child. Could you teach me? Margaret looked at him, this American boy who had grown up in peace, who had never known bombing or starvation or loss. He was watching her with genuine interest, no suspicion, no judgment. Yes, she said, I can teach you. They spent an hour at the piano, Margaret teaching, Jimmy learning. When they finished, Dorothy was standing in the doorway watching. She met Margaret's eyes and smiled. A real smile. Something had shifted. September 1946. Margaret missed her period, then missed another. Her breasts were tender. She was nauseous in the mornings. She knew before the doctor confirmed it. She was pregnant. William's reaction was pure joy. He picked her up, spun her around, laughed like a child. Dorothy cried, happy tears. A grandchild, she kept saying. I'm going to be a grandmother. Frank nodded slowly, then extended his hand to Margaret. Welcome to the family, Margaret. Properly. It was the first time he had called her by her first name. Jimmy bought her a book on pregnancy and childbirth, then turned bright red when he handed it to her. Thought you might want to read up on it, he mumbled. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness lasted into the 5th month. Margaret gained weight slowly. The doctor was concerned but not alarmed. First babies can be tricky, he said, especially with the stress of immigration and adjustment. But you're healthy. The baby is healthy. Just rest and eat well. Dorothy became protective, made sure Margaret rested, ate enough, did not overwork, taught her about American childbirth practices, American hospitals, American expectations. It's different from Germany? Dorothy asked. Everything is different from Germany, Margaret said, but she was smiling. April 3rd, 1947. Margaret went into labor at 4 in the morning. William drove her to the hospital in Tulsa, breaking every speed limit. Dorothy sat in the back, holding Margaret's hand, telling her to breathe. The labor lasted 14 hours. Long, painful, exhausting. Margaret spoke in German when the pain got bad, reverting to her native language. William held her hand and had no idea what she was saying, but the tone was clear. At 6:23 in the evening, Margaret and William's son was born. 7 pounds 4 ounces, healthy lungs, full head of dark hair. They named him Thomas William Barker. When the nurse brought him to Margaret, wrapped in blue blankets, she looked down at his tiny face and felt something break open inside her. This child, half her, half William. Born in America, an American citizen, her son. She spoke to him in German first. Willkommen, mein Kleiner. Willkommen in diese Welt. Then in English, because this was his language, his country, his future. Welcome, my son. Welcome to your home. William stood beside the bed, his hand on Margaret's shoulder, looking down at his son with an expression of complete wonder. Dorothy arrived an hour later with Frank and Jimmy. Frank, gruff and uncomfortable in hospitals, walked to the bed and looked down at his first grandchild. His face softened, completely. The stern farmer disappeared, replaced by something tender. He's perfect, Frank said quietly. Then to Margaret, you did good, girl. Real good. It was the first compliment he had ever given her. Thomas changed everything. He was the bridge nobody had known they needed. Dorothy taught Margaret American lullabies. Margaret taught Dorothy German ones. Thomas heard both. Frank, who had maintained careful distance, melted completely around his grandson. He built a cradle by hand, carved and sanded until it was smooth as glass. He held Thomas with the same careful attention he gave to injured animals. Jimmy became Uncle Jimmy, silly and playful, making faces until Thomas laughed, carrying him around the farm on his shoulders. The town's attitude shifted too. Margaret had faced suspicion, the German war bride, the enemy who had somehow infiltrated an American family. People were polite but distant, but a baby changed calculations. Thomas was American, born in Oklahoma, a Barker. When Margaret walked into town pushing the pram, women stopped to look at the baby. And once they looked at Thomas, they had to talk to Margaret. And once they talked to her, they realized she was just a woman, a mother, a person. Mrs. Henderson from the general store started saving fabric scraps for Margaret to make baby clothes. Mrs. Chen from the restaurant brought by a casserole when she heard Margaret was exhausted from night feedings. Reverend Matthews asked if Margaret would like to join the church choir. They needed sopranos. Margaret's English improved rapidly. Taking care of Thomas meant constant communication. With the doctor, with other mothers, with William's family. She made mistakes, mispronounced words, confused idioms, but she kept trying. One afternoon in July, she was sitting on the porch with Dorothy, both of them shelling peas while Thomas slept in his cradle. The Oklahoma heat was thick, cicadas singing in the trees. "Do you miss Germany?" Dorothy asked suddenly. Margaret thought about it, really thought. "I miss what it was," she said carefully. "Before the war, I miss my parents, my brother, the life I thought I would have." She paused. "But that Germany is gone. What is there now? Ruins and rebuilding and memories. This is my home now. Thomas's home. William's home. Your home. My home." Dorothy looked at her. "You mean that?" "Yes." "Good." Dorothy went back to shelling peas. Then softer. "I'm glad William found you. I'm glad you're here." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Me too." 1948. Margaret became a United States citizen. She took the oath in Tulsa, wearing her best dress, William and Thomas beside her. When the judge said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Barker, you are now an American citizen," she felt a strange mix of pride and loss, proud of her new country, mourning the old one. 1949. William was fully discharged from the Army. He used his saved military pay and a veteran's loan to buy 50 acres adjacent to the family farm. They built a small house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window facing east to catch the morning sun. Margaret planted a garden, tomatoes, beans, squash, and a small section of German vegetables she managed to find seeds for. She taught the local women how to make sauerkraut properly. Soon, half the town was fermenting cabbage in their basements. 1950. Thomas started walking, then talking. He called Margaret Mama and William Daddy and Frank Opa, the German word for grandfather that Frank secretly loved, though he never admitted it. Margaret got involved in the school system. Her teaching certificate from Germany was not valid in Oklahoma, but she volunteered, reading programs, tutoring struggling students. Eventually, the principal asked if she would be interested in teaching German language classes. There was growing interest in foreign languages. She taught twice a week, small classes, mostly high school students curious about Europe, about the war their fathers had fought, about the language of the former enemy. The first day, a student raised his hand. "Mrs. Barker, were you in Germany during the war?" The room went silent. 20 teenagers waiting. Margaret looked at them. Children born during the war or just before, too young to remember, old enough to be curious. "Yes," she said simply. "I was there." "What was it like?" She thought about the ruins, the hunger, the fear. The moment an American sergeant had handed her a plate of food and changed the trajectory of her life. "It was very difficult," she said carefully. "War is difficult for everyone, for soldiers and for civilians, for winners and for losers. I lost my family, my home, almost my life. Many people lost much more." She paused. "But I also learned that humanity exists even in terrible times. That kindness can cross enemy lines, that people are not their governments." The students listened, really listened. One girl asked, "How did you meet Mr. Barker?" Margaret smiled. "He gave me breakfast, and then he kept giving me breakfast. And then he gave me a future." 1952. 7 years after the war ended, Margaret received a letter from Germany. The return address was unfamiliar. She opened it with shaking hands. The letter was from Father Klaus, the priest from the church where she had married William. He had tracked her down through military records and immigration files. "Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well in America. I am writing with news I thought you should know. Your brother Karl has been found. He was captured by the Soviets in 1945 and held in a prisoner of war camp in Siberia. He was released last month and made his way back to Germany. He is alive, thin, traumatized, but alive. He is currently staying at the church while he tries to rebuild his life. He asked me to contact you if I could find you. I have enclosed his current address. He would very much like to hear from you. Yours in Christ, Father Klaus. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor and cried. William found her there 20 minutes later, still clutching the paper. He's alive, she said in German, then switched to English. My brother, Carl, he's alive. William read the letter. Then he pulled her into his arms and let her cry. That night they talked. William had been saving money to expand the farm. Margaret had been saving money from her teaching for a car. They looked at their savings together. What if we brought him here? William said. Margaret looked at him. What? Your brother. He has nothing in Germany, right? No family there except you. What if we sponsored him to come here? We have room. The farm needs help. He could live with us until he gets on his feet. William, that would cost the sponsorship, the travel, everything. So we use the savings. We can expand the farm later. We can buy a car later. Your brother just spent 7 years in a Soviet prison camp. He deserves better than rebuilding ruins alone. Margaret stared at her husband. This man who had given her food in the rubble, who had married her despite the obstacles, who had brought her to America and built a life with her, who was now offering to bring her brother across the ocean. Are you sure? She whispered. I'm sure. August 1953. Margaret stood at the Tulsa train station, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. William stood beside her, Thomas holding his hand. The boy was 6 years old now, excited to meet the uncle he had only heard about in stories. The train pulled in, steam and noise and passengers descending. Margaret scanned every face, looking for a brother she had not seen in 8 years. Then she saw him, thin, much thinner than she remembered, hair graying at the temples even though he was only 31, eyes that had seen too much. But his face, she knew that face. Carl! She moved forward. He saw her, stopped. His expression broke. Surprise, disbelief, relief, grief, joy all at once. They met in the middle of the platform. Margaret grabbed her brother and held on. He was shaking, or maybe she was shaking. Both of them. Du lebst, he said in German. You're alive. Du auch, she replied. You too. They stood there, 2 German survivors on an Oklahoma train platform, holding each other and crying. Finally, Margaret pulled back, wiped her eyes. Carl, this is William, my husband, and this is Thomas, your nephew. Carl looked at William, extended his hand slowly. Thank you, he said in halting English. For my sister, for this. William shook his hand firmly. Family helps family. Welcome to Oklahoma. Thomas, shy and curious, peeked out from behind his father. Hello, Uncle Carl, he said in careful German that Margaret had taught him. Carl knelt down, looked at this American child with German words in his sister's eyes. Hello, Thomas, he said quietly. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen on his face. Carl Hoffman adapted slowly. The farm work was familiar. He had grown up helping in the family bakery, had learned manual labor in the prison camp. Frank put him to work immediately, teaching him American farming techniques. Carl said little. The camp had trained him to silence. But he worked hard, learned quickly, and gradually began to relax. The Oklahoma sky was so different from Siberian gray. The food was abundant. The work was voluntary. Margaret watched her brother carefully. She saw the nightmares, the way he flinched at loud noises, the way he hoarded food at first, unable to believe it would keep coming. She had been there. She understood. Dorothy understood too. She fed Carl constantly, watched him gain weight, never asked invasive questions. When he was ready, he would talk. 3 months after his arrival, Carl and Margaret sat on the porch after dinner. Thomas was playing in the yard. William was in the barn. The evening was soft and warm. Tell me about Mom and Papa, Carl said quietly in German. Margaret told him. The bombing, her mother's death in the cellar, her father's slow decline from pneumonia and starvation, the ruins, the digging through rubble. Carl listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. I thought you were all dead, he said finally. In the camp, I convinced myself everyone was gone. It was easier that way. No hope meant no disappointment. He looked at her. And then Father Klaus found me and told me you were alive. In America. Married. With a child. It seemed impossible. It almost was impossible, Margaret said. She told him about William. The food, the daily meetings, the decision to marry, the immigration nightmare, the crossing, the adjustment. He saved you, Carl said. Yes. Does he know? What it means? What he did. Margaret looked through the window at William, who was walking back from the barn, tired and content. I don't think he sees it that way. He just saw someone who needed help and helped. That's who he is. Carl shook his head slowly. American innocence. They don't understand what they have, what they saved. Some do, Margaret said. William does. He just doesn't talk about it. 1954. Carl met a woman at church. Her name was Patricia, called Patty by everyone. She was a widow. Her husband had died in the Pacific Theater in 1944. She had a daughter, Susan, who was 8 years old. Carl was terrified of her, this American woman with her easy smile and direct questions. But Patty was patient. She saw past the trauma to the gentle man underneath. They married in 1955. It was a small wedding. Margaret cried through the whole ceremony, happy tears this time. Her brother, who had survived hell, building a life, finding love. 1956. Margaret and William had a second child, a daughter. They named her Dorothy after William's mother. The older Dorothy cried when they told her, then baked 3 pies to celebrate. Thomas was 9, protective and proud of his baby sister. He carried her around carefully, spoke to her in both English and German, told her stories about the farm. Margaret's teaching expanded. The high school asked her to teach full-time. She was hesitant. Dorothy was still an infant, but William encouraged her. We have help, he said. Mom will watch the baby. You love teaching. Do it. So she did. German language and literature. 5 classes a day. Students who were curious about Europe, about foreign languages, about the woman with the accent who had come from the other side of the war. She was good at it. Patient, thorough, passionate. She made German interesting. Not just grammar, but culture, history, music, food. She brought in German newspapers, played German music, cooked German food for her students to try. One student wrote in an essay, Mrs. Barker makes me understand that people on the other side of wars are still people. That enemies are just people who were born in different places. That understanding each other matters. Margaret kept that essay, tucked it into her desk drawer. Evidence that maybe, somehow, small bridges could be built across old battlefields. 1961, 16 years after the war ended. William surprised Margaret with plane tickets to Germany. Time to see how far they've come, he said, and time to say proper goodbyes. They left the children with Dorothy and Frank. Thomas was 14, responsible and capable. Dorothy was 5, adored by her grandparents. They would be fine for 2 weeks. The flight was Margaret's first time on a plane. She gripped William's hand during takeoff, watched America shrink below them, and tried to imagine what she would find in Germany. The country had changed. West Germany now, rebuilt with Marshall Plan money. Frankfurt had skyscrapers. Munich had new buildings. Wide streets, prosperity. The ruins were mostly gone, replaced by modern architecture and bustling commerce. Margaret felt disoriented. This was Germany, but not her Germany. The language was familiar, but the country felt foreign. They visited the town where she had grown up. The bakery site was now a clothing store. The school where she had taught was rebuilt. Modern, clean, nothing like the old building. The church where she had married William was still there, restored and beautiful. Father Klaus was still the priest, older now, grayer, but with the same kind eyes. Margaret, he said when he saw her, you came back. They sat in his office and talked for hours, about the rebuilding, about the people who had survived, about the ones who had not, about Carl's release from the Soviet camp, about the letter that had reconnected them. You saved us, Margaret said. You helped me survive. You helped Carl find me. You married William and me when everyone said it was impossible. Father Klaus shook his head. I witnessed your survival. I facilitated paperwork. You and William saved yourselves. You chose to build something new instead of staying in the ruins. Margaret and William visited the spot where they had first met. The rubble was gone. A small park stood there now, with benches and flowers and children playing. This is where you gave me breakfast, Margaret said, pointing to where the ruins had been. William looked at the park, tried to imagine it as rubble and destruction, could not quite reconcile the past with the present. Different world, he said. Better world, Margaret corrected. Then more honestly, different, not perfect, but better than it was. They stood there together, an American farmer and his German wife, survivors of a war that had tried to make them enemies and had instead made them family. 1968. Thomas graduated from high school. He had grown up bilingual, bicultural, comfortable in both American and German worlds. He spoke German fluently. Margaret had insisted on it. He understood both his mother's history and his father's. At graduation, he gave a speech, the valedictorian address. He spoke about bridges, about understanding, about the fact that his mother had been born in Nazi Germany and his father had liberated concentration camps, and somehow they had found love in ruins. My parents taught me that people are not their governments, Thomas said, that humanity exists in the darkest times, that yesterday's enemies can be today's family. I am alive because my father chose compassion over hate, because my mother chose hope over despair, because they chose each other when everything said they should be enemies. Margaret sat in the audience, crying quietly. William held her hand. After the ceremony, an elderly veteran approached them. He had been in William's unit, had known him during the war. Barker, the man said, shaking William's hand, heard you married a German girl. Some of the boys thought you were crazy. Maybe I was, William said mildly. The veteran looked at Margaret. Ma'am, your boy just gave one hell of a speech. Made me think about things differently, about what we fought for, not just to defeat Germany, but to defeat hatred, to build something better. He extended his hand to Margaret. Thank you for raising him right. Margaret shook his hand. Thank you for your service, she said carefully. She always felt strange saying that, thanking men who had fought against her homeland. But she meant it. They had fought against the regime that had destroyed her country, against the evil that had taken her family. The veteran nodded and walked away. William turned to Margaret. You okay? Yes, she said, and she was. 1975, 30 years after the war ended. Margaret was 53 years old. William was 55. They had been married for 30 years. Thomas was in graduate school studying international relations. Dorothy was in college, studying education. She wanted to be a teacher like her mother. Both children were fluent in German and English. Both understood their history. Carl ran a successful bakery in town. He had finally returned to the family trade, using old German recipes that had survived in his memory through years of imprisonment. His wife Patty managed the business side. Their daughter Susan was a nurse. Frank had passed away in 1972. He had died peacefully, surrounded by family, in the same house where he had been born. His last words to Margaret were, "You're a good daughter. Glad William found you." Dorothy still lived on the family farm. She had taken over the main house, still cooked enormous meals, still corrected everyone's grammar. She and Margaret had become true friends, not just family by marriage, but chosen family. Margaret still taught German. She had taught hundreds of students over the years. Many of them returned to visit, telling her how her classes had opened their minds, how learning about Germany had changed their understanding of history, of war, of humanity. One afternoon, Margaret and William sat on their porch, the same porch where they had sat thousands of evenings before. The sun was setting over the wheat fields, gold light everywhere. "What are you thinking about?" William asked. Margaret considered. "Gratitude," she said finally. "I am thinking about how one plate of food changed everything, how one moment of kindness can alter the entire path of a life." William was quiet for a moment. "I think about that too," he said, "about how close we came to never meeting. If I had been assigned to a different unit, if you had been in a different part of the city, if I had walked past without stopping," he shook his head, "all the tiny chances that had to align. You saved my life, Margaret said. Not the first time she had said it. Would not be the last. You saved mine too, William replied. Maybe not from death, but from living a smaller life. From never knowing what it means to build something from ruins. From never knowing you. Margaret reached over and took his hand. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of building a life together. 2 children. 1 granddaughter now. Thomas had married and had a daughter. A farm. A community. A home. Do you ever regret it? She asked. The complications. The judgment. The difficulty. William laughed. Every damn day. Margaret swatted his arm. Liar. Okay, yes, I'm lying. He squeezed her hand. Not once. Not for a second. You were the best decision I ever made. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting. Around them, Oklahoma continued its evening routine. Crickets started their singing. Lightning bugs blinked in the growing darkness. The smell of summer hay drifted on the warm breeze. Inside the house, the phone rang. Dorothy calling probably, or Thomas checking in. The sounds of family, the sounds of a life built from rubble and hope, in a single moment of human kindness. 1985, 40 years after the war ended. Margaret was 63. She had retired from teaching the previous year. William was 65, still working the farm but talking about slowing down. They were invited to speak at the local high school, a special assembly for the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II. Veterans were speaking, historians, and William and Margaret, an American soldier and his German war bride. They stood together on the stage in front of 500 students. Margaret spoke first in English that still carried a trace of German accent after 40 years in America. She told her story, the war, the ruins, the hunger, the moment when an American sergeant had appeared with breakfast, the letters, the crossing, the difficult adjustment, the building of a family. I came to this country with 1 suitcase and a marriage certificate, she said. I was terrified. I was alone. I spoke broken English. I had lost everything except hope. She paused. America gave me a second chance. Your fathers and grandfathers gave me a second chance. William gave me a second chance, and I tried to deserve it. Then William spoke. He talked about the war from his perspective, the combat, the destruction, the moment when he saw a young woman digging through ruins and recognized her humanity despite the uniform he wore and the propaganda he had been taught. I was supposed to see an enemy, he said. Instead, I saw a person who was starving, and I had food. It was that simple, that complicated. He looked at Margaret. Marrying her was against regulations, against expectations, against everything I had been taught about Germans. But it was the rightest thing I ever did. The students listened in absolute silence. This was not abstract history. This was 2 people standing in front of them, living proof that old enemies could become family. During the question period, a student raised her hand. Mrs. Barker, do you still consider yourself German? Margaret thought about it. Really thought. I am German-American, she said finally. I will always be German. That is where I was born, where I was formed, where my history lives. But I am also American. This is where I built my life, raised my children, became who I am now. I contain both. They are not contradictions, they are layers. Another student. Mr. Barker, were you ever afraid of marrying an enemy? William smiled. Terrified, but she was never my enemy. She was just Margaret, a teacher who loved children and missed her family and deserved better than starvation. The war made us enemies. We chose to be something else. After the assembly, students surrounded them, asked questions, wanted to hear more, wanted to understand how love could exist across battle lines. One girl, maybe 16, said to Margaret, I'm half Vietnamese. My mom came here after the Vietnam War. My American dad married her. Everyone says it's different, but it's kind of the same, right? War and love and building something new. Margaret looked at this girl with her mixed heritage and her understanding eyes. Yes, she said, it is very much the same. Hate is easy. Fear is easy. Building bridges is hard, but bridges are what we need. 1995, 50 years after the war ended. Margaret was 73. William was 75. They had been married for 50 years. The family gathered for their anniversary, Thomas and his wife and their 3 children, Dorothy and her husband and their 2 children, Carl, now 73 and retired from the bakery, with Patty and Susan and her family. 30 people crowded into the farmhouse where William had brought Margaret 50 years before. Dorothy, William's mother, had passed away 2 years earlier. She had lived to 96, sharp and commanding until the end. Her last words to Margaret had been, "You take care of my boy." The anniversary party was loud and chaotic and perfect. Grandchildren ran everywhere. Food covered every surface. American food and German food mixed together, just like the family. Music played. Stories were told. William's brother Jimmy, now 68 and still living in Oklahoma, stood up to make a toast. 50 years ago, he said, "My brother brought home a German wife, and everyone thought he was crazy. My parents were worried. The town was suspicious. I was confused. I was 19 and didn't understand anything." He paused. But Margaret became the heart of this family. She taught us compassion. She taught us that people are not their governments. She taught us that building something new is always possible, even from ruins. He raised his glass. To Margaret and William, to 50 years of proving that love is stronger than war. Everyone drank, cheered, hugged. Later, when the party had quieted and most people had left, Margaret and William sat alone on the porch. The same porch, the same view, 50 years of evenings. "We did it," Margaret said quietly. "Did what?" "Built a life. From nothing. From less than nothing. From ruins and rubble. And a plate of breakfast." She looked at him. "We built all of this." William looked out at the farm, at the house full of family, at the fields he had worked for 50 years, at the woman beside him who had crossed an ocean and learned a new language and built a home in a foreign country because he had offered her hope when she had none. "Yeah," he said, "we did." The sun set over Oklahoma, the same sun that had set over German ruins 50 years before, the same sun that had witnessed the end of a war and the beginning of a marriage, the same sun that now shone on children and grandchildren who existed because an American sergeant had chosen compassion over indifference. Margaret leaned her head on William's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat in the golden light, 2 survivors who had found each other in the worst of times and built the best of lives. Somewhere inside, a grandchild laughed. The sound drifted out through the screen door, mixing with the evening air. The sound of family, the sound of peace, the sound of a future that had once seemed impossible. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, in German, then in English. "Danke, thank you." "For what?" "For the breakfast, for everything that came after." William kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for saying yes." They sat together as darkness came. The stars emerged one by one. The same stars that had watched the world tear itself apart. The same stars that now watched it knit itself back together, one family at a time, one moment of kindness at a time, one choice at a time. "If you shoot her, you shoot me." Those words, never spoken but always present, had changed everything, had saved a life, had built a family, had proven that even in the darkest times, humanity endures. That compassion crosses battle lines. That love survives war. The porch light flickered on. Someone inside called them for dessert. William and Margaret stood slowly, older now, slower, but still together, and walked back into the house full of light and noise and family. Behind them, the Oklahoma night descended on the farm, peaceful, abundant, familiar.